Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this week's edition of Judaism 201. We've been doing prayers. We're going to take a 1-week break to talk about Parshas Shelach because it is such an exciting parsha. There's too much here to pass over, which is not a reference to Passover. All right, so I'm going to talk about 4 or 5 topics. One of them is, the first one is, what were the spies thinking? The second one is, what was their error? The third one is, what was their sin? And those are 2 separate things, because you can make an error in judgment, and that's not really necessarily a sin. The fourth thing is, how does this relate to Tisha B'Av? And the last, of course, is, what's our takeaway for us? So, without further ado, what were they thinking? Remember that Moshe handpicked these people. They're supposed to be the leaders of their tribes, or among the leaders. And so they were on a high level. And so there must be something we can learn from them if we can try to understand where they're coming from. So according to tradition, they actually were living a pretty good life, all of Bnei Israel at this point. Granted, they were in the desert, but recall the food was provided to them with the man. Water, there was Miriam's well, followed them along, so they had unlimited supply of water. The Midrash says even their clothes didn't wear out. And it was sort of, in a way, I guess you could say it was air-conditioned. They were protected by the Ananei Kavod, the clouds of glory. So if that's the case, when they were not traveling, what were they doing? And the answer given is that, well, they did some davening, and they did some learning, and they had the best teachers, like, Moshe Rabbeinu. Imagine sitting in on a shiur from him, right? And maybe the analogy today would be something like, for those of us, I don't think any of us did it, but many of our kids had a gap year in Israel, where they didn't have to work, and all they were doing is learning and experiencing the holiness of Israel. Or we may remember our own days if some of us had it easier in college. For me, I went to a state school. I didn't have to work my way through, so life was pretty good when I was in college for me. But when they were to enter Eretz Yisrael, they knew that they would have to get involved in worldly matters. The man ended the day after they entered the land. Was the day that the man ended. The well, when Miriam passed away, the well ceased to exist, and they would have to do things like plowing and planting and reaping and being property owners and engaging in business and all the stuff of the real world. So essentially, they'd have to go from a world of ruchnius to gashmius, right? From their gap year or their gap generation, their gap 40 years, into the land and experience the real world, which actually reminds me of I thought it was a cute comment made by somebody. There was somebody in our community. He had his whole life, he was, a yeshiva bacher, and then he did a gap year and this and that. And then he got married and got a job, and he moved to Fairfax. And I remember his second week here, he came to Shabbos services one morning, and he looked at me and he said, my whole life, I never got Shabbos before. This is a kid who's been observant, right? But it was because he was like in the real world, working and being a newlywed and like all these things. And he was like so happy Shabbos came. So, I guess you could think of the whole time in the desert as Shabbos. And the spies knew that it would, coming into Eretz Yisrael, maybe it would be like a Monday morning. It wouldn't be so much fun. I'm going to talk about what the spies actually said, but one of the lines they said that it is a land, it's a land that consumes the people, and that's exactly what they meant. So, what was their error? And one way of expressing it, I think, a really good way of expressing it is they were victims of binary thought in a way. And what I mean by that is that life was either magical with all kinds of miracles, or there'd be, you'd have to exist in real life. You know, you were either, working on the farm in Kansas or you were in the land of Oz. You know, there wasn't anything in between. And it's defensible in a way. After all, Hashem didn't show his face in Mitzrayim for over 200 years, right? And suddenly they're whisked out with all these magical plagues and Kriyas Yam Suf, and they're in the desert, and everything is, suddenly they're in a world of magic. So they had absolutely no experience of any concept even of maybe miracles going on in everyday life, or Hashem being involved in everyday life. It was either fantasy land where Hashem is doing everything for him, or the drudgery work of real life. In other words, they knew that Hashem was capable of miracles that were contrary to nature, but they never saw any miracles that were working within nature, and that was sort of their problem. So what was their sin? So that's pretty, in my mind, that's pretty defensible. So what did they do wrong? What did they do so wrong? So here, let's look at the text. For those who have a Chumash, it's right at the end of Shemos, Exodus chapter 13. I'm going to start reading in verses 26. You don't need a Chumash because I'm going to read it. I'm just going to read the English here. So this is what the spies said. They said, "We came to the land that you sent to us. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." You know, there's that picture of, right, the grape clusters were so big they needed 2 men to carry them. However, the people who inhabit the country are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there, which might mean giants. That's a whole nother subject for a whole nother discussion. So far, they're not saying anything wrong. The Amalekites dwell there, and the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites. So it's pretty scary, but pretty accurate. And then they say, we can't attack that people because they are stronger than we are. That might have been the case, actually. And they continued, and they said, and the land that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its inhabitants. So we just talked about what that meant. All the people that we saw in it are men of great size. And we saw the Nephilim there. We're not sure what that means, the Anakites. And we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them. It doesn't sound so bad, actually. They were fairly accurate. The Medrash talks about, one Medrash focuses on one sentence that they said that was going too far. It's very interesting. Of all the sentences they pick out the last one. Now, I'm not sure if they pick out the last one because that was a summation of the whole thing, or if this particular pasuk was their specific error or sin. But where they said that we look like grasshoppers to ourselves, and that's what we must have looked like to them. And the Medrash is like all over this. By the way, I want to mention what that is. I want to mention Onkelos. Onkelos is it's in the side of every Chumash. And what's interesting about Onkelos is that Onkelos was a person, we're not exactly sure who he was, but the general consensus is he lived around the time of Chazal, the sages, and he learned from them what the Pesukim meant. And he translates the Pesukim into Aramaic because that's what the people understood. But he also, a lot of the mystical, or the Pesukim or verses that were not so understandable, he sort of changed the translation so that it would more accurately reflect what Chazal thought it meant. So, for example, one quick example, I don't want to get sidetracked too much on this. At the end of Sefer Bereshis, Yosef, Yaakov gives a blessing to all his children, and they are like incomprehensible if you translate them directly into English, right? So one blessing to one of his children is, your teeth shall be as white as milk, and it's like, what does that mean? And Onkelos' translation has nothing to do with teeth or whiteness or milk. He explains, this means when you come into the land, or this or that. So a good place to look for those of us, not included, for those of us who are good in Aramaic, of what a pasuk means, looking at the Onkelos is very interesting. Onkelos actually, so after all that, I shouldn't have gone down that tangent, because after all that, this translation is very straightforward. So he says, Be'ene nafshana ke kamsin v'chein haraya ve'eneha. So kamsin is a word for grasshoppers in Aramaic. So that's so the Midrash is very, they don't like that sentence. Now, it's a good segue to the fourth topic, which is, what does all this have to do with Tisha B'Av? Hold on one second. So the Gemara tells us that this took place on Tisha B'Av, and that on Tisha B'Av there would be many calamities in the future. There's another Gemara that says the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash took place on Tisha B'Av, and the second Beis HaMikdash took place on Tisha B'Av, or right around that time. Now, I'm the kind of person who, fine, you can just say that it happened on Tisha B'Av, but, show me the evidence, show me the money. If you make an extraordinary claim, you need something to back you up here. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. I find this the most interesting part here. So the Midrash, again, as I said, focuses on the grasshoppers. And then it says, this is a very weird statement. The Midrash says that Yirmiyahu, a.k.a. Jeremiah, gave Musar to Bnei Israel by putting the pei in front of the ayin. What is that about? Well, we know in the Hebrew alphabet goes a samach, ayin, pei, fe. So the pei goes before the ayin. The ayin goes before the pei. Samach, ayin, pei, fe. And we also know that pei means mouth and ayin means eye. So what is the statement that Yirmiyahu gave Musar by putting the pei in front of the ayin? What's it talking about? What he's talking about is Yirmiyahu, aka Jeremiah, wrote Eicha, Lamentations. Eicha, of course, is what we say on Tisha B'Av. We recite Eicha on Tisha B'Av, both in the evening and during the day. And it's a description of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Now, what's very interesting about Eicha, and this is exactly what that cryptic sentence of the Midrash is saying, is that the first Eicha is 5 chapters. The first 4 chapters all go by the Aleph base. However, chapters 2, 3, and 4, the ayin goes before the pei goes before the ayin. It's out of order just for 3 of the chapters. It's out of order, 3 out of the 5 chapters. So the Gemara now explains this, and the Gemara in Sanhedrin says this is because pei means mouth and ayin means eye, and therefore it's a reference to the sin of the spies. How so? The Gemara says because they said with their mouths things that they did not see with their eyes. And what they're focusing on is that the one thing they totally made up, they could not have known, was that the people of the land perceived them to be grasshoppers. They couldn't read the minds of the people in the land. Fine, if they have, they may perceive themselves as grasshoppers because they're insecure or whatever. But to then go and project that onto other people and say the other people saw us as grasshoppers, this is what the Midrash and the Gemara means, that they spoke of things that they did not see. So that's a connection between this whole thing and the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, destruction of first base of Mikdash. What's more interesting, what's more fascinating, is the connection between this and the second base of Mikdash. I hope I have it here. Do I have it here? Yes. Okay. There's a passage in Gemara Gittin that talks about the destruction of the second base of Mikdash. Some of us are very familiar with that passage because on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to study Torah, and there's a list of like 5 main exceptions where you can study. And one of them is learning this part of Gittin because well, we're not supposed to study Torah because it makes us sad. It makes us happy, and you can't do that on Tisha B'Av. However, this passage in Gittin talks about the destruction, and so you're allowed to study that part. So I want to read parts of it, and we're going to hit a surprising thing. So some of you may be very familiar with this story. I'll just go over the beginning of it very quickly. So there's a certain man who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. Now, I just used the word Kamsin before. Anybody remember that? Kamsa is the Aramaic word for grasshopper. That's how Unclos translated that pasuk there, right? Be'einei nafshana kekamsin, plural of Kamsa. Kamsa is grasshopper. So there were 2 people, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Now, Bar means son of in Aramaic, but it also can mean like you're a follower of. So for example, a bar mitzvah means you follow the mitzvahs. It doesn't mean you're a son of a mitzvah, right? So Kamsa and Bar Kamsa here is a direct allusion to like the grasshoppers and the Meraglim and the spies, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. But let's continue. So for those of you who know the story, I'll go very quickly. So this person had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. He made this big party, and he told his assistant, go and invite Kamsa, my friend. And the person by accident invited Bar Kamsa. So when Bar Kamsa showed up, the host was very angry and said, look, you're my enemy, you got to get out of here. So Bar Kamsa said, I'm already here, let's not make a scene, I'll pay for my food, just, I'll just stay in the background, I'll be fine, everything will be fine. And the owner said, no, you got to get out of here. So Bar Kamsa then said, I tell you what, I'll pay for half of this banquet, just don't publicly embarrass me. And the guy said, no, I'm throwing you out. And then Bar Kamsa said, I'll pay for the entire banquet. And the man again said, no, I'm going to throw you out. And he did. He picked him up and he physically threw him out. And all the important rabbis were there, and they didn't say anything. Now, later on, it's sort of a tangent when they say that the rabbis played a part in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. They're referring to this part here, that the rabbis didn't say anything while this host made a public spectacle and physically threw Bar Kamsa out of his party. Now, because Bar Kamsa saw that the rabbis saw what was going on and didn't say anything, he decided he wants to spread slander against the rabbis. And it's very interesting the phrase they use. There's a colloquialism apparently in Aramaic. It's called Eichel Behu Kurtza, which literally means they ate Kurtza. That's the phrase for they spread slander. And Rashi explains, this is a very weird thing. Rashi says that I guess this was in a time when it was not quite as hectic as today. So how did people spread slander? They'd come over, they'd schmooze with you have a cup of coffee, and then you talk, and then you engage in Lashon Hara. And what they would do is they would eat, and while they're doing it, maybe they'd sort of wink, meaning like you and I are in the know, and this winking apparently had a big part of spreading the slander, and the Hebrew word for wink is keretz. So this eating kartzin apparently is a phrase for spreading slander. So again, we have this connection of mouth, speaking and the winking with the eye. But listen to this connection. So he decides to spread slander. So what does he do? He tells one of the Roman authorities, you know what, the Jews really don't like you, and they want to rebel against you, and I can prove it to you. You know what? Send them an animal for sacrifice. It was allowed for non-Jews to do that. They could send animals to be sacrificed. Send an animal for sacrifice, and they're not going to accept it because it came from you. So he picks out this fine animal, and they send it to the temple. And listen to this part. He says, as he was going to the temple, he caused a blemish in the calf's lip, or some say he caused a cataract in the eye. So the question has to be asked, why are you telling us this detail? And not only is it a minor detail, but you're telling me two versions of it. But if we look deeper, it's obvious, right? The lip and the eye, the whole thing is the mouth or the pei, the mouth and the pei. And not only that, but the words they used, they didn't, for causing a blemish in the lip, he calls the lip, he says, beniv safsayim. And most people translate beniv safsayim as words, things that come out of your mouth, bad things that come out of your mouth. So that's the first version. The other version is what they did to the eye. And it says, bedukin sheba'ayin. Now, bedukin is sort of a strange word. We don't fully understand it. So Rashi explains it a little bit and refers us to a passage in Yeshayahu, aka Isaiah. What's really interesting, I think, with all this is like all the rabbis are like in on all these connections, but nobody actually like comes out and says it's straightforward. That's what this year's about. I'm trying to say it's straightforward. So we go to Yeshayahu, and what do we see there? We see an amazing passage. You might recognize the first pasuk. The second pasuk is going to surprise you. So the first pasuk is chapter 40, verse 21. It says, do you not know? Have you not heard? Have you not been told from the very first? Have you not discerned how the earth was founded? Very lofty. And listen to the next line. It is he, meaning Hashem, who enthroned above the vault of the earth, so that its inhabitants would seem like grasshoppers, who spread out the skies like gauze or a film. And this film is the word dukin, or kadok, dukin, and that's what they did to the eye over here. I know it's a little bit confusing, but my point is twofold. One is that this whole idea of grasshoppers like covering the earth or being seen as grasshoppers, and also this idea of not being able to see correctly. Again, the whole thing with the mouth and the seeing, not being able to be seen, not being able to see correctly because things are going on. Either mentally because you've been told different things, or insecurities, you're saying the wrong things. But we're not saying things correctly, and we're putting the eye before the pei. Now there's another example of this. Oh, by the way, that chapter, the very chapter we're referring to, chapter 40, the chapter starts off, tell me if you've heard this one before, starts off, Nachamu, Nachamu. And where do we know that phrase from? Nachamu, Nachamu. Shabbos, we get the name of Shabbos Nachamu from that Haftorah, Nachamu, Nachamu, which means comfort, comfort. And it's the Haftorah that we read the first Shabbos after Tisha B'Av. It's called Shabbos Nachamu. We read this Haftorah. So again, another tie-in to Tisha B'Av, and Hashem's going to comfort us. That's what the Nachamu is. So what is it about like grasshoppers and not seeing and all that stuff? Why do they keep coming up? We know that locusts, right? When locusts or grasshoppers fill the sky, they can almost blot out the sun. And in fact, that is exactly how the Torah describes the plague of locusts. Locusts are grasshoppers. So they don't use the same word, chagav, which is grasshopper, but the plague of locusts. And what does that verse say? It says the locusts will cover the surface of the land so that nobody will be able to see it. But how do they describe that? If you look at the verse, Shemos chapter 10, verse 5, Exodus, it says, V'chisa, and they will cover ayin ha'aretz, the eye of the earth. There again, the ayin is showing up in the same thing with grasshoppers. So again, we see this connection between grasshoppers and not being able to see. And by the way, what's the plague after grasshoppers? It's the plague of darkness, where we really can't see. All right, so I've thrown a lot out. Let's try to connect it together. What are we going to learn from all this? So the obvious one, which is when you read a lot of commentary on all this, the obvious one is lashon hara. We shouldn't speak about things we don't see. Sinas chinam, causeless hatred, is what destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And sinas chinam, causeless hatred, is caused by lashon hara, right? How do you get senseless hatred? It's because somebody told you some story that, you know, the Jews are bad because they do this, or those people over there are bad because they do that. That's or so and so is bad because he did this. That's so sinas chinam caused the Beis HaMikdash, but it was the lashon hara which caused the sinas chinam. And this whole idea is such a terrible thing to talk about things that we haven't seen about, that, you know, making up stories or hearing rumors. We didn't see it, we don't have evidence, but we pass along these things. It's a terrible thing. Okay, so that's sort of an obvious thing. But what's a deeper message? And what a deeper message we can learn is from examining the motives of the spies in a more positive light, that's how we started off this year with, right? So the mistake was thinking that the world is divided into two parts, ruchnius and gashmius, spirituality and physicality. And given the choice of the two, the spies thought it's better to live in the world of ruchnius and spirituality. Of course it is. But we know, you know, especially if, you know, those of us who have listened to Rabbi Deitch over the years or been influenced by Chabad Hasidus over the years, that our mission is to integrate the two, to make the world a dwelling place for Hashem. We need to integrate the Ruchnius and Gashmius. The Rebbe has an interesting sikha where he takes this one step further, and he knows that there is a place for pure Ruchnius in our daily lives. And he points out, after all, that's what tefillah is. And that's what Torah study is. It's pure ruchnius, where we're shutting out the outside world, at least temporarily. And that's what we're all doing right now, right? We're taking a break from our work or whatever we're doing, and we're talking Torah. And whatever's going on in the outside world, you know, we're not checking our phones yet, you know, or whatever we do. We're not doing that right now. Right now, we are involved in pure ruchnius. And the Rebbe's pointing out, that's a good thing. It's okay to have aspects of pure ruchnius. But the key is, what are we going to do when this half hour is over, right? Are we going to take any of the spirituality that we've learned and experienced and bring it into the real world? My favorite example that I like to use is Yom Kippur, right? Frankly, between you and me, it's easy to, right? We all know it's kind of easy to be holy on Yom Kippur, right? We're not eating, we're in shul all day, we're dressed up. The services are really long. I mean, who's got time to think about, you know, the real world when you're on Yom Kippur? And we feel elevated and we feel holy. But that's the easy part. The hard part is, what do you do the day after Yom Kippur? So actually, you know, in order to keep us involved with ruchnius things, that's why there's a minhag to start your sukkah right after Yom Kippur. But seriously, you know, the main point is, you know, can we take that message and move it and move it further, carry it further into our world? And there's one more thing that the Rebbe points out in the sikha that I've been learning recently, is that it's not only to bring ruchnius, spirituality, into the world, but to bring it to our fellow Jews. As the Rebbe said, you know, even if you only know Aleph base, or even if you don't even know Aleph base, even if you only know Aleph, you can still teach Aleph to somebody else. And I think that's a really powerful lesson. Whatever we may think of our, limited amount of spirituality and knowledge that we have, and compared to real Talmudic Chachamim, none of us know anything. Me neither. It's like they know so much and they can teach so much. And compared to us, we're, dare I say, maybe we're even like grasshoppers compared to them. But we can still bring that to other people. The limited amount that we know, we can still bring it to other people. And so my bracha to all of you as we head towards Shabbos is to take to heart the lesson that we learned from the Spies. And that is that we should all grow in spirituality. We should all spend time with Ruchnius, bring Ruchnius into, we should spend time in tefillah and in Torah learning, and we should grow in our Ruchnius, and we should grow in our Torah learning, and we should connect to Hashem by learning about the prayers. And by the way, thank you for showing up to the prayer series that we've been doing. Hopefully that will help us in our davening. But also, besides all the prayers and the Torah learning we're doing, to integrate those lessons into ourselves and bring it into the world and bring it into our fellow Jews. Bring those lessons to our fellow Jews. So a very advanced Shabbat Shalom to everybody. And